Okay, welcome back, everybody. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I hope you had a good break. Welcome back. We're going to crack on with the next two talks. First up, we've got Will Bishop, originally from New York, but now living in Amsterdam, where he works at Miro. You may have heard of it over the past few years. He's a developer advocate there. And we're going to get into some nitty-gritty details. Now, enough of that design shit. Let's get into the nitty-gritty engineering stuff. And we're doing a full life cycle of software products here. We've talked about, how features get researched and designed and coming up with the creative solutions. But what about at the other end, when it's time for that feature to be taken outside, taken out to the back of the barn, and put out of its misery? Well, that's what Will is going to talk to us about today. He's going to tell us how to deprecate a feature the right way. Please give a big welcome to Will Bishop.
Awesome. All right. Let's crack open some water real quick. All right. So first of all, thank you all for joining this talk. As just being alluded to, we're going to shift a bit from designing it to building it, or rather deconstructing it, I suppose. So just by show of hands, to start us off, how many of you have worked with a feature or a capability that didn't behave exactly like you might have expected it to? No. Okay, I guess we're not all that shocked. It's safe to say we've all had an experience kind of like this, right? Maybe it sounds a little bit like this. You go to the DIBI after party, you have a few extra pints than you planned for, and you wake up the next morning and you want everything to just work, right? You want to be able to sign on and just use the same piece of software that you use every week. Except this time, when maybe you're a little hungover, you see something like this. Whoops. Okay, you see something like this. Essentially, something you use all the time is no longer behaving like you expected it to. It's maybe some dependent service that you rely on is throwing these crazy kinds of 500 errors, and despite no changes on your end, this is what you're seeing. Maybe you and your team spend the next 2 hours trying to debug this, only to realize that this was a dependent service that's been deprecated, but you weren't expecting it. So, this is a really critical area where trust is built or lost with developers or end users or partners, whoever is actually consuming your software. So in the next, 20 minutes or so, I'm going to walk us through how to develop a deprecation strategy that avoids the pitfalls of frustrating situations like this. So first, just a little bit about me. My name's Will. I'm a staff developer advocate at Miro. If you're not familiar with Miro, it's a visual collaboration platform that essentially allows you to serve as a source of truth for all different sorts of platforms, run retros, things like that. It's essentially a whiteboard as a service. I, however, work specifically on our developer platform, which extends the power of Miro via our APIs, our web SDK, and a JavaScript-based kind of iframe solution. So I'm really passionate about APIs in particular and the interconnectedness of the web. And I'm really excited today to distill some of my learnings, having been through several deprecations at organizations like Miro, Zoom, Meetup, and a few others. So these are a few of the things that we're going to touch on today. First, deprecations, as you could tell by the name of the talk. What is deprecation and why do we do it? And then I'm going to talk a lot about trust. I work on a developer-facing product, so I'll be talking about developer trust. But this could be end user trust or partner trust, whoever your end user really is. We'll talk about a concrete example with a case study, and then I'll touch on retirement, which is what any good deprecation policy ultimately aims to achieve. So let's kick this off with a simple question. What exactly is deprecation? And I chose Twitter's example because, well, first of all, this was a while ago. And second of all, they did a really good job of being clear and concise when it comes to defining deprecation and retirement. One of the most important aspects of deprecating a feature the right way is ensuring that your audience understands how you're defining things and that it's kind of universally understood. So, Twitter defines deprecation as essentially something's no longer recommended. If you find a bug or something, we're not going to fix it. And they define retirement as actually this feature or capability is no longer accessible. It's impossible to use. So, if you and your team aren't clear on how you're defining these phases of end of life, then you certainly can't expect your end users, whoever they may be, to understand how to approach deprecations and the things like that going forward. So while I choose to share this example, because it's very simple and clear, the reality is that there's a lot of different terms out there. You're going to see things like sunset, decommission, end of life, and the terms vary. But there is an overarching structure to these two periods of time. So in any end of life phase, you have this first period where something's no longer the recommended way to use. It's not technically supported, but it still works. And that's how I'm going to define deprecation. And then we have this second period of time where actually it's no longer viable, it's impossible to use it. And for today's purposes, that's how I'm going to define retirement. So now that we have an agreed upon kind of definition for this end of life phase, why do we deprecate features in the first place? Well, we deprecate features in the first place because any healthy feature or capability should be constantly evolving, right? The features and capabilities you have in your products today could become less relevant, perhaps even irrelevant to your product over time. And this is exactly where deprecation comes in. We need a way to offload the time and resources and money that we're spending to keep up with legacy technologies or features. And instead, we can focus that time and energy on actually evolving our latest and greatest capabilities. So now that we understand what deprecation is and why we do it, how do we actually develop a strategy that achieves these goals? Well, it all starts with trust. So whether that be end user trust, if you have a very general product where users have to explore something in the UI, or developer trust if your service is an API or an SDK or something like that. And this is one of the biggest areas to identify up front as being a large risk. Why is that? The reason is because you're making kind of a formal commitment down on paper, so to speak, that your feature or your capability is going to function or not function when you say it will. And end users and developers, they may actually rely on your software as the backbone to some core infrastructure. Kind of as we opened this up, just because something's deprecated doesn't mean that's where it stops. It could be running other services as well. More succinctly, trust is directly tied to business impact. So how do we avoid this risk, and how do we minimize risk to the business? Well, we avoid this risk by avoiding these ambiguities. So, avoiding unclear timelines. I think we've all, dealt with this. You hear someone say, oh yeah, we know we need to deprecate that. We'll explore that in Q3, or oh yeah, we'll get to that early next year. You really need to be explicit with this kind of strategy. Lack of internal consensus. So, droves of meeting with no concrete takeaways, no action items, kicking the can further down the road until it's actually crucial to start your deprecation. And lastly, undocumented behavior. So this looks like product or engineering changes that weren't communicated explicitly, externally. Try and say that 3 times fast. So it's important to call these out because you have to remember that this kind of strategy, its main intention is to build and maintain trust with your end users or developers. And outside of just feature sets, capabilities, what your product can actually do for someone, the reason they choose it is because they have trust in you and your product. It goes beyond just the capabilities that are presented to them. So, making sure that we maintain this trust relies on us making clear, actionable commitments to our end users. And it also relies on us, anticipating the needs of how a deprecation will actually affect the people currently using our capability. And it's really important to get this right on the first try because you only get one shot. I mean, technically you could take as many shots as you want, but I don't recommend it. If your strategy includes any of these ambiguities I've talked about, then that's where people can start losing trust. So being aware of the risks in this kind of situation is actually in many ways equally as important as knowing what success looks like. So if all goes well, you shouldn't hear much, right? If a feature gets deprecated and there's no noise, it means people knew what to expect, and it happened, and it went off without a hitch. But if things don't go well, you're almost certain to hear about it, right? And even just one bad experience with one end user or one developer this day and age can be the match that lit a forest fire. People talk in communities, they're on your Slacks, and almost never stops with one bad experience. So what concrete steps can we take to make sure that this doesn't happen? Well, let's talk a bit about execution now. So up until this point, we've talked about what deprecation is, the good versus the bad, somewhat in a theoretical sense. But now I'd like to get into some concrete guidance with a case study. And this case study starts with the assembly of our primary stakeholders. And while it's true of almost any strategic initiative within an organization that you have to work cross-functionally, I want to emphasize just how important this is when it comes to deprecation, because you're dealing with customer success, product, engineering, and they all have very distinct roles. But when it comes to deprecation, you really need to have cohesion amongst these groups. So more than just bringing these people together, it's really important to have one dedicated person to hold point on a strategic initiative like this. And even more than just having one person, it needs to be someone who's really at the center of the experience and has true empathy for your users. So for instance, myself, working at Miro, I'm part of a developer relations team. I'm supposed to be the guy who just really understands developers and knows exactly how they're using our product. It makes perfect sense that I would help be that person in this process for us deprecating a previous version of our platform, which I'll speak to in a moment. But this could look different depending on your organization, right? If you are a more general product, UI-based, this might be a product manager or a designer, which many of you are here. But if it's a developer-facing product, this might be an engineering lead. So make sure that you're taking into account what makes sense, but ultimately it should be someone who really gets the product leading this kind of initiative. So if you have this working group with all these different parts of your org, what types of challenges should you be thinking about and looking out for? Well, I'll refer to these as the big three. If you don't get these right, it's really hard to get the rest of this kind of strategy for deprecating a feature the right way right. So first, timelines. From a product and engineering perspective, how can you be certain, or as certain as possible, that your new version of this feature or new endpoint, whatever it might be, is actually going to be ready? And then from there, start reverse engineering. Okay, if this is when feature X is going to be ready, when do we need to deprecate feature Z? Going back from there, when do we need to have communications ready? Keeping going back there, like when do we need a strategy? You see where I'm going with this. So basically just trying to understand anticipated readiness and working backwards from there. Dependencies is the second thing. So, are there limitations or dependencies that you're not necessarily explicitly aware of right now, but things could crop up? And this is one of the hardest things to prepare for because you don't know what you don't know, right? But that said, do your best to build in these buffer moments where you're accounting for last-minute things or things you're not thinking of. And lastly, messaging. So, this should be well-informed, and really importantly, it should acknowledge impact. You never want to act like deprecating a feature is not a big deal. Of course, it depends on the usage of this feature, but making sure that you're really having that empathy for your end user and appreciating that things will change for them. So aside from these things that we have to be thinking about internally as a working group, there's also outside influences that we need to consider as well. Like really any good plan, it's invaluable to know how others have tackled this problem before you. And this is especially important if you are perhaps like a smaller organization, less mature, maybe you're a startup and you've actually never had to deprecate a feature before. At Miro, we had a good sense of what a deprecation would require, and we had in-house experience with this, but we still paused and took a moment to actually do our due diligence and understand the landscape. And actually, this is something that should raise more questions. So, as we started looking at some of these big logos on the right-hand side of the screen, we started realizing, okay, there are certain things we hadn't even thought about. For instance, like, should our deprecation policy be part of our terms of service? Should our deprecation policy include a versioning policy, or should it be related to that? These are the kinds of things that you want to make sure that you're incorporating to the extent that they make sense. So, for example, if you are a developer-facing product and you're looking at, these big logos like Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, then take what makes sense. But if you are a smaller product and you're not a developer-facing product and you're looking at Facebook and Twitter and you're looking at, what they've done, a large portion of it might not be relevant. And so it's really important not to force things into your strategy just because you see others are doing it. You really need to distill what makes sense for you and your org and leave out what doesn't make sense. So this is a big part of the puzzle where judgment comes in and will really be important to determining your success. So with this in mind, let's take a closer look at our Miro case study and see how we tackled this. So for a bit of context, we had a V1 developer platform, which consisted of APIs and a web SDK, and we rebuilt it from scratch. So we wanted to improve the developer experience, extend our capabilities, and that's why we needed a deprecation policy, because we were going to introduce this new platform, and we wanted to start offloading the time and resources to keep up the old one. So looking at this timeline, just to give you a sense of what this looked like for us, kind of a hands-on sort of, a real-life situation here. Over here on the left-hand side, we've got the very beginning of our timeline where we convened that working group and we started, looking at those outside influences, working with stakeholders in the business, so, head of product, people who've seen this before, and we said to ourselves, okay, guys, what's our best guess based on all the information we have right now as to when we're going to be ready to retire our platform? And that's what we, used to jump to the end of the timeline here over on the right-hand side. And from there, our best guess was where we reverse engineered from. So before that, I really explicitly want to call out this section over here that says monitoring the adoption of V2, which is our new platform, and our best effort at feature gaps. So this is an area that I think is one of the second biggest areas for risk, because if you are too hasty and you don't consider things towards the end, a really big risk is prematurely retiring a feature or capability. And you have to be realistic, and actually, even more than that, you have to be honest and transparent. So, at Miro, we stuck to our internal commitments of making a best guess at what this timeline was going to look like, but we also wanted to make sure that we were going to communicate any changes in our timeline accordingly, and assure developers that we weren't going to retire our V1 platform until it could do all the same things, or until our V2 platform could do all the same things. And I think Steve Jobs gets at this really well, unsurprisingly. He says, when you innovate, you make mistakes. It's best to get on with them, or it's best to admit them and get on with other things quickly. And I think what I'm getting at here is that end users or developers, whoever it might be, they appreciate it when you keep it real with them. They don't want to be bullshitted. They want concrete things that they can take away, even if it's an update that maybe they're not looking for. It can be really difficult to achieve things like feature parity between versions. And in fact, you may not always get there 100%. Business forces us to make really hard decisions, and that's one of the biggest challenges with coming up with this type of strategy is how do we meet our internal commitments while also meeting the needs of our users. But if you're as transparent as possible and you give as much information to your end users and developers along the way, then you can rest assured that you're forging a stronger relationship that can actually weather the storm of bad news, realistic updates. They can handle it as long as they're informed. So deprecating a feature the right way, it requires you to be realistic about each phase of end of life. So, deprecating something is only half the battle, right? You also need to nail your retirement. And if you're looking at how new services are performing, something's going to replace an older legacy technology, you have to be realistic. You can't go ahead and shut off critical infrastructure just because you want to meet an internal commitment that you made on a best guess kind of effort. Rather, you need to look at what's actually happening. So in our case, when we released our new set of APIs and our new SDKs, we started looking at the number of new API credentials that were being generated each week. We started looking at the number of API calls that were happening each week. And this is what we use to kind of have a go or no-go decision. But if expectations don't match reality, you might need to be open to making adjustments. In some ways, this might go against what you expect in a strategy, right? But especially when it comes to a deprecation and a retirement, again, you can't shut off what could be critical infrastructure for someone just because your plan has to change. So it's a balance, actually. It's a balance between your internal plan and your internal commitments, but more specifically, it's a balance between that and the needs of your end users and your developers. So really keeping in mind that empathy. So, what does this look like in practice? Well, at Miro, for us, this looked like, honoring our tradition of being transparent and honest with developers. It looked like advocating with our product and engineering leads on really delivering those key features that users were going to need before we actually retired our original capability. And more than that, it's just keeping them at the heart of everything you're doing. So with this in mind, let's take a look at the deprecation policy that we came up with at Miro, which really guided our strategy, and in some ways is a public-facing version of our deprecation strategy. So it consists of 3 critical components. The first is a concrete timeline. So we came up with a 6 months duration for our deprecation period. And this was based on those internal conversations with stakeholders early on, talking with engineering to understand feasibility and what these timelines might actually look like. And lastly, talking with customer success to understand how much time we thought people would actually need, and then adding a little bit to that. Next, a commitment. So here it says a commitment to developers, but this could be end users, this could be partners. It really depends, who your software is, for. But just letting them know that when deprecation comes, they're going to have all the things that they're going to need. This is really a commitment to them in saying that you can trust us. Yes, things are going to change, but here's a migration guide, or here's a resource to help you go from A to B. And lastly, a clear definition of deprecation versus retirement. Here's precisely what to expect in each phase of end of life. If your policy has at least these 3 things, then it should be clear to end users or developers that they can trust both you and your product holistically. So with everything we've discussed so far in mind, the point I'm trying to drive home is that deprecating a feature the right way is not something that can happen overnight. Rather, it's a process. This is something that it can't happen in a silo, and it has to be really well thought out, and you have to put up the work ahead of time to get the best result. And even more than that, this process relies on taking into account all of the considerations we've talked so far about. And if you remember nothing else from today's talk, I think these 3 things really get at the core of what's important, and that is a cross-functional approach, bringing in the right people, making sure they're in the room with you, and really working on it as a group. It's about having end users at the heart of your strategy. Again, having someone there who really understands how your product is used and what this is going to look like when something changes. And perhaps most importantly, it's about time and resources upfront. So making sure that you're not waiting until the 11th hour to make some kind of hasty decision to turn something off just because you had this plan and you're trying to stick to it. So if you're able to honor each of these parts of the process, then you can rest assured that you've set yourself up to ideally deprecate a feature the right way.
Thank you, Will. The whole time I was listening to you, I was just thinking of xkcd.com/1172, which is the one in Hiram's law, that every feature, whether intentional, unintentional, or a bug, will be relied upon by someone somewhere.
Exactly.
Have you come across that where you're deprecating something like no one's even going to notice when we switch this off?
It's true. And it's a big part of, I think, doing the work up front too, is looking at the data, understanding usage, even if it seems like a small deal because only 5 people are using it or something, maybe those are 5 super users, or maybe one of those people is a partner,
And something we're kind of taking for granted in what you're talking about is that we're talking about online software here, right? We're talking about API endpoints, stuff like that. Showing my age, but I remember when I could walk into a shop and buy a piece of software from the shelf and install it, and then that was my software, and it didn't matter what happens at the HQ of the company that sold me that software, it wasn't going to change. Was networking computers a mistake?
Oh, that's a big question.
No, but you know what I mean? Like do you almost wish for that day when like you install a piece of software, that's it. It's the piece of software now. It's not going to
It's safer, but I think part of the silver lining to having to deal with deprecations and retirements is that, again, it kind of comes back to the fact that your software is evolving and things are getting better, ideally. So if you need to deprecate something, it's kind of a good sign. It means that you're not just a stale future capability, but you're actually working on the next big thing.
Yeah. Do we have questions from the audience? Oh, we've got one here. Let's get a microphone.
Thank you for the talk. Obviously, I'm a designer, but I worked in some companies where they had a really huge legacy. They were focusing on the growing rather than the performance. And at some point, they had to get rid of everything because the enterprise solution was not able to handle. So they paid a lot of money and they built everything again on SAP. So have you experienced an example where it was very costly not to deprecate things early in the process or not to addressing that early?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think the situation you've just described in many ways could make deprecation easier or maybe require less time because it's not so much about building something that's different. It's actually about just enhancing something. And you might have less trouble with trying to close those feature gaps towards the end, right? If you're just kind of building the same thing. But then I think you also have to be careful because you can fall into the trap where you're like, oh, well, it's the exact same thing. So people can do it and they'll be fine. But you have to make sure you're looking out for those nuances, kind of similar to those few users that were using a specific thing in a specific way that no one ever expected. But the impact was actually quite large. So I think in that situation, it's again, just making sure you don't fool yourself into thinking that it's fine just because you've rebuilt a better version, but it might still be different.
You briefly mentioned versioning. Now, Tim Berners-Lee said, cool URIs don't change. That applies to API endpoints too. Is that the whole point of having a version built into the endpoint so you'd never have to retire it?
Yeah, so actually, this talk is a shorter version of another one I gave where this whole second half of the talk is about versioning, unsurprisingly. And the reason it's so important when it comes to deprecation is because versioning is something you do throughout your product lifecycle, ideally, right? It's not something that you introduce just when you need something new. It's something that you should have in place, consistently. And then we start talking about backwards compatibility, breaking changes. If you have a good versioning strategy, and there's always an expectation that there's going to be something new, but it's clear how that compares to a past version, this makes deprecation a lot easier because you've already got half of the battle solved in terms of setting expectations and really helping people understand what's coming next and what the behavior should be.
But presumably that's not necessarily front of mind of a startup getting a product to market is
right.
thinking about
yeah.
the long-term future.
And then you're talking about the situation where you're kind of building the plane as it's going off the runway, and yeah, that would probably be one of the first things I would scrap as well. But then again, startup life is there's a fire drill at 3 a.m. and someone's on their computer fixing it. When you get to be a larger organization, obviously you have more time and resources to do things, I guess, the right way.
Yeah, plan that. All right, thank you so much, Will. Really appreciate it. Will Bishop, everyone.